This move opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, immediately contesting the center and aiming for rapid development and initiative. This move, 1, e5, mirrors white's central pawn advance, establishing an equal claim in the center and immediately preparing to develop pieces and challenge for control of key squares. This move develops a knight towards the center, attacking black's e5 pawn and preparing to castle, a fundamental principle in opening play. This move, developing the knight to c6, is a classical response, embracing the open game and controlling central squares while preparing to potentially develop the f8 bishop. This move, the Raul Lopez, immediately puts pressure on black's knight and aims to develop a strategic advantage by potentially creating weaknesses in black's pawn structure later in the game. This move, the Berlin defense, is a sharp and theoretically deep response to the Raul Lopez, immediately challenging white's knight and aiming for a balanced pawn structure by potentially exchanging pieces. Castling kingside is a fundamental move in this Raul Lopez opening, securing the king and connecting the rooks for future play. This move, b7, is a standard developing move in the Raul Lopez, preparing to castle kingside and defend the e5 pawn, reinforcing the central control that black aims to maintain. This move develops the knight to a central square, preparing to castle and reinforcing the pawn on e4, while also opening the diagonal for the queen. This move solidifies black's pawn center and prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, often g4 or f5, while avoiding the immediate pressure of the Raul Lopez on the c6 knight. This move forcefully challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and create attacking opportunities. This move develops the bishop to a more active square and prepares to challenge white's central pawn majority. This move prepares to challenge black's central pawn by potentially advancing the e-pawn, while also creating a more active position for the rook on the semi-open e-file. This capture is a standard response in the Raul Lopez, leading to a more open position where white will likely recapture with the knight, aiming to develop their pieces harmoniously and exploit the central pawn tension. This recapture on d4 opens the e-file for white's rook and immediately contests the center, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure. Black completes kingside development and secures their monarch in a standard Raul Lopez Morphy defense, classical variation, preparing to address white's central pawn presence. This move repositions the bishop from a potentially more active diagonal to a less congested square, preparing to support a queenside build-up or retreat if necessary. This move exchanges black's knight for white's knight, simplifying the position and allowing black to potentially develop their remaining pieces more freely while opening the d-file for future play. The queen recaptures the knight, centralizing the queen and preparing to contest the d-file while maintaining the pressure initiated by white's earlier pawn push. This move repositions the bishop to a square where it supports the knight on d4 and prepares to contest the open d-file, but it also temporarily obstructs the queen's control of the c-file. This move aims to expand on the queenside and gain space, challenging black's control of the c6 square and potentially opening lines for white's rooks. This move subtly repositions the king away from the potentially vulnerable c6 square, creating an escape route on g7 and preparing for future pawn advances on the kingside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially support a future kingside attack. This retreat of the knight to g8 is a strategic redeployment, aiming to reroute it to f6 via h6 or e7. reinforcing the kingside defense and potentially preparing for a kingside pawn push. This move repositions the knight to a central outpost, challenging black's control of d5 and potentially creating attacking opportunities on the queenside. This move prepares to challenge the strong white knight on d5 and aims to improve black's kingside pawn structure, potentially opening a file for the rook. This knight maneuver repositions the knight from the outpost on d5 to a more flexible central square, potentially supporting a future e4-e5 advance and eyeing weaknesses on black's kingside. This move prepares to reroute the queen to potentially support the central pawn push or reinforce the kingside defense, while also creating space for the knight to maneuver after white's knight occupied d5. This move repositions the rook from the semi-open e-file to a more flexible square, preparing to potentially support a central pawn advance or reinforce queenside play. This move aims to activate the queen and pressure white's knight on d5, potentially disrupting white's central control and opening lines for black's pieces. This move prepares to dislodge black's active pieces, particularly the queen on g4 and the bishop on c6, by creating potential space for the king and opening lines for white's rooks. The queen repositions to the c8 square, seeking a safer vantage point and potentially preparing to support a pawn advance on the queenside, or to contest the open c-file later. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the weakened dark squares around black's king after the previous pawn advances and rook moves. The bishop retreats to a more passive square, potentially hindering the development of the kingside pieces and allowing white to maintain pressure on the queenside. This move centralizes the queen, aiming to control key squares on the d-file and potentially attack weaknesses on white's kingside, while also preparing to support advances like c4. This move is a tactical concession, allowing white's queen to gain a powerful central outpost on d5 and forcing black to defend passively rather than developing an active counter strategy. This move activates the queen to the 7th rank, targeting the weak h7 pawn and potentially creating threats against the black king. The move k8 seeks to centralize the queen, potentially prepare for bxe4 after white's bishop retreats, and maintain flexibility for future counterplay. The queen retreats to d1, a passive square, aiming to escape the g4 influence and potentially reposition for a more effective defense or counterattack later, though it concedes important central control and tempo. This move initiates a repositioning of the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a central advance or preparing to contest the f-file. This knight move centralizes the knight, offering it as an exchange to eliminate white's strong knight on d5 and simultaneously prepares to challenge the light-squared bishop on c4. Exchanging the bishop for the knight on e6 eliminates a strong attacking piece that was targeting your king and also opens the d-file for your rook. This move consolidates white's central control and opens lines for the queen and rook, aiming to exploit black's somewhat passive bishop development. The move qg6 is an attempt to activate the queen and target white's kingside pawn structure, while also preparing to potentially contest the b1h7 diagonal if white's bishop retreats. The king's move to g2 is a prudent defensive maneuver, creating a safe haven for the king away from the open diagonal and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside while consolidating the position after the exchange of pieces. This move repositions the bishop from a potentially vulnerable advanced square back to a more solid defensive and coordinating role, preparing to support a potential kingside defense or even a pawn advance on the kingside. This move, qxd6 sacrifices the queen to gain a decisive material advantage by winning 2 pawns and creating a dangerous passed d-pawn, fundamentally altering the game's trajectory. This move, 24, b-flat-6, is a defensive maneuver to protect the weakened light squares on the queenside and to prevent white's knight from establishing a strong outpost on c7. This move repositions the rook from the half-open e-file to a more active role on the second rank, preparing to challenge black's control of the c-file and potentially support a kingside advance. This pawn break aims to gain space on the kingside and open lines for your rook, creating counterplay against white's centralized queen and rook. This pawn capture is a critical decision that resolves central tension and opens the e-file for white's rook, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and potential king safety issues for black. This move reintroduces the knight to an active central square, challenging white's control and preparing to support the kingside advance or explore attacking possibilities. White's queen repositions to d3, maintaining pressure on the f5 pawn and preparing to potentially support a pawn push on the kingside or redeploy to the g3 square if necessary. This forcing knight check is a desperate attempt to create complications, exploiting the slightly exposed white king, but it overlooks white's strong central control and active pieces. The king repositions to the safety of the g2 square, evading the immediate knight check and preparing to defend the kingside should black's attack continue to develop. This move boldly sacrifices the rook on f2, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and create tactical complications by opening the f-file for the queen and potentially the remaining rook. This move is a critical defensive maneuver, sacrificing the rook to avoid immediate mate and to try and disrupt black's attack. But it leaves white's king exposed. Black recaptures the piece, disrupting white's central control and opening a diagonal for the queen to potentially attack the weakened kingside. The recapture of the bishop on f2 with the queen, qxg6, initiates a queenless middle game where white aims to leverage their material advantage and active pieces to exploit black's exposed king. The recapture on g6 by the knight resolves the material imbalance and simplifies the position, but it returns the knight to a less active square compared to its potential central outpost. This rook maneuver aims to activate the rook on the first rank and support potential pawn advances, or prepare for a regrouping to a more active file. The move brings the remaining rook to the open file, aiming to contest control and activate it for potential action against white's king or pawns. The rook is now placed on the open d file, ready to contest it and potentially support pawn advances or control key squares.